go ahead and get started here. My name is Scott Schneider. I'm the president and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute, and I'm just really thrilled for us to be out here at Arizona State University. I want to thank Arizona State University for working with us to be a part of this caravan, public diplomacy caravan. And I also want to thank the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the embassy for working together with us on this. This is actually the third stop of a week-long tour that we have been supporting. The group was in Atlanta, and then visited Savannah, Georgia, and then Austin, Texas earlier this week. And our final stop is Phoenix, and I have to say that Phoenix, hands down, has the best weather of all the places that we've been to, so I think that will stick in our minds. I also just want to say a brief word about the Korea Economic Institute, because we serve as a support organization for the U.S.-Korea relationship, and we also do a lot of outreach programs, including programs like this. I'm so pleased that we're back at ASU for the second time since I started as president, after having been here last September with both the U.S. ambassador to Korea at that time and the Korean ambassador to the United States. And we had the new ambassador with us for the first two stops, and she sends her apologies and regrets for not being able to come to Phoenix this time because the White House is holding the FIFA World Cup selection ceremony that determines which teams are in which brackets. And so she had to go back yesterday for that. I also just want to acknowledge and appreciate Professor Wu, who worked with us last year, and Professor John, old friends of ours. And thank you to Professor Yunus for your hosting. The other thing that I want to say is that the Korea Economic Institute is also an information provider about the relationship, and we did a survey back in September, our 6th annual survey of American attitudes toward Korea. And related to this discussion, I just wanted to mention really just 2 or 3 things. One, the relationship continues to have strong support from the American public at about 60%. Including for the U.S. presidents, and also for the new trend of inward investment from Korea to the United States. And in fact, only 30% of Koreans are really supportive of tariffs. That's been a big issue in the relationship this year. But there is a lot of support for the investment, as I mentioned, and so much so that these days Americans think about Korea as a technology provider and as a supply chain partner, actually more than they think about the threat from North Korea. And so from my perspective as a longtime Korea watcher, that really stands out as a new dimension of the relationship. And I think that it is a dimension of the relationship that enables the U.S.-Korea alliance to go from one that has been in the past forged in blood to one that going forward into the future is going to be powered by chips, batteries, and critical and emerging technologies. And that's the subject of our event today, critical and emerging technologies, semiconductors and EVs. And so I want to turn it over to the panel and to Professor Yunus for our main discussion. So panelists, please come on.
Thank you very much. So our panelists will join us. And I will ask you to maybe speak for 15 minutes. And before we start, I just want to maybe say a couple of words. As Mr. Stein basically mentioned, this is the second time we are actually hosting the Korea Economic Institute. That was back in September 2024. Then we had the ambassadors. Unfortunately, I wasn't here, so this is the first time I will basically do physical presence. That's anyway, nice opportunity for me. And since you mentioned about the World Cup, which is actually interesting detail, because my favorite World Cup is actually the one which happened in South Korea back in 2002. And you want to guess, because I'm a Turkish American, so that was the only World Cup that Turkey actually managed to qualify, and they managed to actually finish third. So that was a big achievement a long time ago. So I'm hoping that they will actually come to the United States next year. So it's basically like kind of a question mark. One more thing, as a former Floridian, it's kind of interesting because there was a hailstorm in Phoenix a couple of weeks ago. For those of you who live here, so yeah, the weather isn't very nice, but then Phoenix has its own charm and basically uncertainties when it comes to weather. So, okay, so we will basically, do you want to come to podium or you just want to, just, okay, yeah, so I will join you over there, but yeah, please. Yeah. Yes, yeah.
Well, I think we have much in common because the 2002 World Cup is also my favorite.
Okay.
I do remember, yes, kudos to Turkey, they did a very good job at the time.
You finished fourth.
We finished fourth, you finished third.
That's correct.
And for those of you that may or may not know, Turkey was a key contributor during the Korean War. In fact, they fought extremely valiantly, and they sent hardcore combat troops, and so to this day we remain extremely grateful for the service of Turkish men and women who fought in the war. Hundreds have perished, and to this day we do honor their service, so thank you for that. So today we've been asked to talk about supply chains, especially with regard to semiconductors and EV batteries. And I'm sure many of you here are wondering why a Korean diplomat would come all the way to Arizona to talk about semiconductors and EV battery supply chains. And I think it's very important for us to realize that these are not just commodities or key manufacturing inputs. They're in fact some of the key drivers of the 21st century knowledge economy, the 21st century geopolitical picture. Semiconductors, as most of you know, go into all things advanced. In fact, yesterday our team was touring the Samsung factory in Austin, Texas, and we were told that 40% of every EV vehicle, the value of 40% of every EV vehicle stems from the semiconductors, the chips that are in that vehicle. And of course, they're also key to military technology and also advanced technology across the board. So it's in fact one of the defining items that are critical to determining who will actually win the geotechnological, the geoeconomic rivalry of the 21st century, whether between the US and China or other rivals across various regions. EV batteries, likewise, is also very important because, of course, we live in a century where climate change is an overarching challenge, and one of the key avenues by which we can actually seek to address that challenge is to make sure that we have clean energy across the board. Obviously, the greatest emitters of carbon dioxide is the internal combustible engine, so EV batteries in that regard is very important. But on a more geopolitical note, why is again Korea in this picture? Well, because just to provide a few snapshot figures, Korea happens to be the second largest producer of semiconductors in the world, second only to Taiwan. We're also the second largest producer of EV batteries and also other rechargeable batteries, second only to China. And in fact, just a few decades ago, not even a few decades ago, but about a decade ago, Korea was actually ahead of China in terms of our ability to produce and have a greater market share in terms of EV batteries, whether within China or outside of China. But in the past 10 years, we've seen how the competitive gap between Korea and China on the semiconductor front has increasingly narrowed significantly. So our companies are actually afraid that in 5 years' time, we'll be overtaken, surpassed by the Chinese companies on the competitive front when it comes to chips. As it relates to EV batteries, we've already been overcome and overtaken by China. Among the top 5 companies, the producers of EV batteries, there is one Korean company, LG Ensol, which has recently invested significantly here in the state of Arizona. So I'll talk about that a little later, but this provides perhaps the geopolitical context in which these items are being discussed here by the group here. And the choices that Korea makes matter, precisely because of the preeminent position that we have in both of these markets. And we've been investing very heavily in both China and the United States over the past decade and a half. And so to perhaps track the journey of our investments in these two countries is very instructive and helpful in understanding some of the geopolitical dynamics that are actually taking place. So as it relates to, we actually have a scorecard of sorts in terms of how our investments did. And both for EV and for semiconductors, we've been investing tens of billions of dollars in China And the scorecard suggests that for the semiconductor industry, it's in a tenuous position, and for the EV battery industry, as I've said, it's overtaken by China. So, and whereas our investments in the United States have been really growing by leaps and bounds in recent years, in the past decade, where now our companies are increasingly betting their futures on the United States. So we see this divergence in terms of their fate in the Chinese market and their fate here in the United States. And I'll just go through why this happens to be the case. And I'm very mindful of my my Chinese colleague here. It makes for a very interesting discussion because it is, after all, we live in a very competitive world, and today's competitors could be tomorrow's friends, yesterday's friends could be tomorrow's competitors. And it behooves all of us to make sure that we have guardrails around this competition to make sure that this doesn't spiral into something bigger, to make sure it doesn't spiral into conflict. We may have differences, we may have differing economic interests, but we have to make sure that we can all preserve this within certain guardrails that ensures that all of us can be mutually prosperous and secure in our regions without having to fight each other. So, with that said, on the semiconductor front, we have, China continues to rely on the vast amounts of investments that Samsung and SK Hynix have made across China, primarily in Xi'an and Wuxi. But the Chinese are catching up very fast. They're technologically indigenizing the entire supply chain, very advanced across all sectors. So our companies do fear that they will be outcompeted pretty soon. Now, what's adding to that is, of course, the export controls that the United States is adopting that puts Korean companies in a very difficult position. In fact, these export controls are accentuating the plights of Korean companies where, again, one company has invested $27 billion. They're not able to recoup that or further advance that investment any further because U.S. export controls are precluding their ability to actually upgrade their fabs in China. They're only allowed to maintain the current state of legacy chip production. So it's a matter of time before they're over. Of course, the same export controls apply to Chinese companies in China, but it's a matter of time before they get overtaken because of the various constraints that derive from the export controls. So those are two factors why Korean companies, semiconductor companies, are in an increasingly tenuous position. Now the EV batteries their fates have been a little more unfortunate because back in the mid-2010s, they've been very excited about investing into the Chinese market. But of course, China was also cultivating their own domestic industries on this particular front. And so companies went in with the promise that or with the expectation that they would be eligible for various subsidies, only to find that in light of certain conflicts and differences that we've had in our diplomatic relations, and not only because of that particular factor, but they were not eligible, in fact, for these subsidies. So where we stand today is that our Korean companies, which continue to do business in China, have a little over 0% market share in China. So what do these businesses do? Or their operations, what they do is they actually export their EV batteries to Europe and to other markets. So they're transporting their EV batteries on rail across the Eurasian continent and all the way to Hungary and then henceforth to Europe. So now they're starting to expand their operations in Europe. Now in the case of the United States, the reason I say that we're a little more sanguine about the promising prospects of our operations here is because in terms of semiconductors, many of you might have seen the tens of billions of dollars of investments that Samsung has committed to make and have already made in the city of Austin, Texas, and now in the neighboring city of Taylor. And these represent, in fact, the single most advanced manufacturing plants that Samsung has in its entire business empire, aside from the HBM chips, which go into the NVIDIA chips, for instance. But these are the most advanced, the most nano, the smallest 2 nano chips that go into all things AI related as well. On the battery front, here we're in Arizona, and what brought us to Arizona is in fact the $5.5 billion investment made by LG Energy Solution. LG Energy Solution is the 3rd largest producer of these EV batteries in the world, next to only CATL and BYD. And they've chosen this location for a variety of reasons, but a number of factors that facilitated that investment decision was the various benefits that would accrue to them under the Investment Reduction Act. And that has prompted their decision to invest sizably here. And so we're actually partnering with the state of Arizona to make sure that Arizona can transform itself to what they call the global clean energy powerhouse, not only of North America, but of the entire world. And we're proud to be able to partner with them along this journey. In fact, we do wish to see the Arizonan government pitch itself as not the Silicon Desert of the world, but rather the Battery Valley of the world. And hopefully that's something the Arizonians could take to heart as well. So I'd be happy to answer any questions at the Q&A session, but in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that in order for, so no business investment in any market can be guaranteed success. Even, yes, we're making gargantuan amounts of investments here in the United States, but that in no way guarantees their success as well. So if our failure or the difficulties that we encountered in China is any instructive lesson, then we have to bear in mind that for the Samsung operation here to succeed as well, and mind you, we're actually investing these huge amounts of money at the potential expense of hollowing out and deindustrializing Korea's own industrial base. So it's very difficult for us to sometimes justify to our own public why we're making these gargantuan sums of money at the potential expense, again, of deindustrializing our home country. And what's added to that kind of concern is that Korea and the United States have recently agreed to have a total of $350 billion of investments, net investments of Korean money into the United States to help the United States rebuild its shipbuilding capacity, and also to invest in various cutting-edge strategic sectors, including energy and the semiconductor sector. In addition to that, our companies have also committed to invest another $150 billion. That's $500 billion altogether, which amounts to some 30% of our GDP. So we want to make sure these investments succeed, and the best way to do that is to make sure that the commitments and the promises made by the host government here in the United States, whether it's the provincial government, the state government, or the federal government, to make sure that the incentives that were promised at the outset do end up flowing in and are upheld. And that's an important lesson that we've also learned from our experience in China as well. On the EV battery front, in order to ensure success there, we have to make sure that the investments are welcome, that the investments are organically well connected to the local economy, that it is perceived to benefit the local economy, that it is perceived as not replacing jobs here. We know that, of course, the middle class everywhere across the world, here in the United States and Korea as well, we're all having going through a very difficult bout. So making sure that the local community can also perceive these huge investments as benefiting them as well is a critical task that should ensure, that would help to ensure the success of these investments. But I'll just stop there. I think I've been a little lengthy over my time. So.
Thanks much, and my apologies for not introducing our speaker, who is Lee Sun Hwan. He's a polyglot. I still face struggles sometimes, like pronouncing coins, but am I correct?
That's
okay. He's basically Director General of the Diplomatic Strategy and Planning at Ministry of Foreign Affairs in South Korea. So our second speaker is going to be one of us, who is Dr. Sung-Ying Yang, who is Assistant Professor at Historical, Philosophical and Religious Studies at ASU. Are you going to have a presentation? Okay, please, yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Sung-Ying Yang, and I am a historian of modern Korea here at ASU. Now, my specialty is not economic history, but more political intellectual history. But in general, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of Korean-American relations. And I specifically want to talk about the transformation of this relationship from one of dependence to more of an equal partnership, and how it relates to national security. So just a couple of years ago, in 2023, South Korea and the U.S. celebrated several milestones in their relationship. So it was the 70th anniversary of the ROK-U.S. alliance, which was concluded in 1953. Now ROK, or ROK, stands for Republic of Korea, the formal name of South Korea. It was also the 75th anniversary of the founding of South Korea in 1948, in which the U.S. played a very major role. And it was also the 120th anniversary since the start of Korean immigration to the United States in 1903. So as we can see, just with these milestones, the Koreans and Americans have had a very long relationship. Even before them, right, the U.S. and Koreans also, concluded a treaty of amity and friendship in 1882. So it goes even further back. But in this long duration of this relationship, of course, there have been changes and transformations. And especially in this early period in the 1940s, 50s, and even the 60s, the relationship was very one-sided, you could say, where the Koreans were, of course, very dependent on the Americans, given just the fact that the South Korean country itself was established so recently, but also they had to undergo a devastating 3-year war in the Korean War in the early 1950s. And the U.S. saw South Korea more as sort of a means to an end, in which South Korea was a sort of linchpin to their national security strategy in East Asia, in which Japan was at the center. And so Korea has long been considered a so-called dagger staring at the heart of Japan. And so, in the Cold War, with the threat of communism, or the very anti-communist stance that the U.S. government had, they saw South Korea as a sort of shield to Japan and the rest of East Asia. But that was basically what the U.S. attitude towards Korea was. Both sides saw each other as defending their national interests. But now in the 21st century, it's become, I think, less of this sort of subordinate patron-client relationship into much more of an equal partnership. This is not to say that means to an end doesn't exist, of course. Both countries still view each other as crucial to each other's national security. But I think at least the footing is much more equal, much more of an end in itself, in which both countries want to maintain this relationship for its own sake, much more so than in the 1950s. So I do, before going into the economic side of things, which is of course the focus of today's panel, I did want to talk about the military side because of the origins of this alliance being in national security. So the U.S. began its military presence in South Korea in 1945 with the end of World War II, when the Americans and the Soviet Union entered Korea to accept the Japanese surrender after World War II. And the U.S. was leaving, but then in 1950, the North Koreans invaded South Korea. The U.S. re-entered Korea to defend South Korea, and then permanently have left their troops there. And even today, just under 30,000 soldiers remain. They sort of act as a tripwire, you could say, against the North Korean invasion, in which if the North Koreans invade, it would automatically trigger an American intervention. And there's also the U.S. nuclear umbrella behind which the South Koreans feel protected, and so don't pursue their own nuclear weapons. And even to the present day, there have been joint military exercises that show the deep level of cooperation between the U.S. and Koreans. And as I mentioned, they have had a formal military defense treaty or an alliance since 1953. But again, this was very much informed by Cold War interests and Cold War needs. As I mentioned, South Korea was seen as a bulwark against communism in East Asia for the U.S., and South Korea really depended heavily on the U.S. for national survival, especially in its economy. And it was very one-sided in this early period. At the same time, the South Koreans did also contribute their own military forces to this alliance. For example, in the Vietnam War, when the South Koreans were one of the few American allies to really substantially send troops to Vietnam. And in fact, a total of about 300,000 soldiers sort of rotated into Vietnam by the end of the conflict. And another feature of this military alliance has been this permanent military presence, which are congregated in military bases in various parts of South Korea, Army and Air Force bases. But these bases have not been always received positively by the Korean public. The very fact of having a foreign military base, a foreign military presence for decades, and also this quirk in the alliance in which the Americans still maintain wartime operational control of the ROK Army has caused many people to criticize this form of relationship as maybe not as equal as it's advertised. Maybe it's even a sort of neo-colonial relationship. Those criticisms have been made. But on the whole, I think, as I'll show at the very end, most Koreans still view this alliance in a positive light. But I do want to now shift to the economic side of things, because this is really where I think the transformation is really, it's much more visible. So after the devastation of the Korean War, South Korea, as I mentioned, was heavily dependent on American assistance. So after 1953, the Americans sent billions and billions of dollars worth of economic and military aid, which the Koreans desperately needed. Even the Korean government budget was very much dependent on this American assistance. They just did not have the economic foundations to sustain their own economy. So, the American aid took the form of food, grains, flour, even things like condensed milk, which school children consumed. Many of the older generations of Koreans will often have memories of having condensed milk in school and at home from American sources. Fertilizer to help agricultural production. So these were all very crucial components of aid that the Koreans used to build up their economic foundations. Another interesting feature of this aid was paper. So the Koreans faced a severe paper shortage from the 1940s and 50s. And so things like even textbooks for school children, this is heavily dependent on this foreign assistance. Now my main research is on intellectual history, and so I look at school textbooks from back in the day, and I noticed in the inside cover of several textbooks from wartime, you have this message from the Minister of Education himself, I think was Baek Nak-jun at the time. The government printed, right, and exhorted the students in these textbooks, we should be very thankful for foreign assistance in producing these textbooks, and let us be good students and repay this favor. So even in forms of, in all these various sectors, the economy, but even education, this American assistance was crucial to Korea's development. But it was especially in the 1960s that South Korea's economy transformed. And there's of course a lot of debate about who deserves credit for this. Many historians and much of the Korean public would attribute this to the policies of the Park Chung-hee authoritarian regime that ruled South Korea in these decades of the 1960s and 70s, during which this economic takeoff began. It was not a free market economic system, but a guided capitalism or developmental state model in which the government intervened heavily in the economy. But I think what needs to also be emphasized is the U.S.'s role in this, because the U.S. created this environment, this security environment in which South Korea could feel secure behind it and could concentrate their efforts and resources less on the defense than they might have needed to if the security umbrella was not present. This security environment was crucial in allowing Koreans to focus on the economy. There are even things like the Vietnam War that actually helped spark economic growth. So the Korean War has often been seen as crucial to Japanese economic development in the 1950s, and the Americans requiring procurements in the Korean War, and the Japanese were willing to supply, so that's how they recovered from World War II. But similarly, for the Vietnam War, it served the same purpose for South Korea. So the American military actually paid the wages of South Korean soldiers during this time, and South Korean soldiers don't make much money, at least back in the day, and so they actually got a lot more than they usually did if they were stationed in Vietnam, and they would often remit this money back home to South Korea. So this was actually a huge source of income. And the American military actually contracted several key businesses, including the huge conglomerate of Hyundai, which benefited greatly during the Vietnam War. So in a sense, you could say the South Koreans actually profited from war during the Vietnam War. And this was a spark, another catalyst for economic development during this time. And also very crucially, the U.S., because it was so invested in keeping South Korea stable, to make sure that it remained a bulwark of anti-communism, they were willing to open up their markets to South Korean products, to South Korean exports, and also for Japanese exports. So this is a coordinated strategy for its East Asian allies. And as a result, trade between the U.S. and South Korea ballooned ever since the 1960s. And so if you look at this table, you can just see how quickly Korean-American trade increased. But you might also notice that what used to be a trade surplus for the U.S. Became quickly a trade deficit, and South Korean exports to America quickly rose while imports from America did not quite keep up. And so perhaps there was this sense of maybe Korea, maybe to a lesser degree than Japan, but Korea also became less of a client state into now actually a competitor. But despite that, I think we can see the fruits of this trade in the U.S. and South Korea today. South Korean exports used to have this very poor reputation of being cheap and unreliable. Made in Korea was a sort of insult actually back in the day. But now so many folks around the world, including the U.S., look at South Korean products from companies like Hyundai and Samsung as premium goods that are sought after. So we can see just how how deep of a change this was in this economic relationship. Now I think the semiconductor industry is quite interesting, and it really kind of embodies the marriage of national security and economic, this national security and economic relationship, because they're not separating these two features of the relationship. Right? Both are intertwined, and the semiconductor industry is a very good example of this. So even though this relationship has become much more of a partnership than a patron-client relationship, right? These national security interests still drive both sides, and motivate each side to maintain this relationship. So, South Korea, as has been explained previously, is a very crucial part of the supply chain. And if South Korea kind of stumbles, the global supply chain might also stumble, and American security interests might also come into question. And so and I'm not an expert at all on this, and so the other speakers I hope will explain much further. But just briefly, superficially, I do want to say how this is just one example of how South Korean economic health has actually become now very deeply relevant to American national security. It's no longer just about having a stable country to stave off communism during the Korean War, but now the advanced state of the South Korean economy is actually crucial to the Americans maintaining their own global security interests. But again, I'm not an expert on this at all, so I'll defer to the other panelists. But to sum up, I do want to talk about this transformation of Korean-American relationships from a sort of marriage of convenience from the Cold War for both sides into now an actual, much more equal partnership centered on economic cooperation. The Koreans no longer depend on economic aid and are now major trading partners, and in fact usually run a trade surplus with the Americans. But at the same time, despite this transformation, national security remains very relevant and has become very closely connected to this economic relationship. Of course, there's this rise of China that both countries are guarding against. There has been this continued North Korean threat, and there's now the new North Korea, China-Russia axis that seems to be rising, that the U.S. has been trying to counter by gathering its allies in Europe and East Asia. But there are a lot of, this is a very, very, very brief overview of this very complicated topic. I'm overlooking a lot of things, but despite its ups and downs, despite its issues, I think we can see that the South Korean public itself, at least, has been very much willing to maintain these strong relations with the U.S., including economically. And if you look at certain opinion polls, you can see this bear out. So despite a kind of very brief dip in 2016, we can see that most of the South Korean public do see hope that Korean-American relations will continue to improve in the future. And although for a time in the early 21st century, South Koreans began to see China as more important to economic interests, after 2017, and likely because of the THAAD issue and the controversies around the THAAD deployment, the U.S. regained its status as Koreans, number one, or the country that Koreans view as the most important to their economic success. And then for national security as well, the U.S. has maintained an overwhelming position as the top country most important for Korea's security. And most Koreans still want to maintain this alliance even after potential reunification with North Korea. And in this direct comparison between China and America, the support for this Korean-American alliance, especially versus China, has risen over time. But I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you, Suyun, and I actually bought a car for my son this summer. He's 16, and I bought a Kia, so I can testify that they actually make it very good cars. So our third speakers also came from Seoul, Dr. Ho Young Lee, who is the assistant professor at Korea National Diplomatic Academy.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Ho Young Lee. I'm working as an associate professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, doing research and training future diplomats. And my area of expertise is international trade policy and recently economic security as well. I believe that the two former speakers have noted about the positive aspect of the U.S.-Korea relationship in terms of economic relations, but I think I will be dealing more with the challenging aspects of the relationship. Since I'm a trade policy expert, I've been monitoring the U.S. trade policy, and as you may know, very well know, tariffs have been a challenging issue for exporters like Korea, and so it's been a very interesting but very difficult year for South Korea and really in its trade relationship with the U.S. So as Professor Yang has mentioned, the semiconductors and EV batteries and the strategic industries that we have been talking about when we're talking about technology, they're all about economic security. So the marriage of national security and economic relations. And when we're talking about economic security, there are some major main tools that are used to strengthen economic security in the area of technology. And they are mainly tariffs, import tariffs, and subsidies, and export controls. So I will be talking about these three main tools of economic security related to the semiconductor and EV, electric vehicle batteries. Well, the first thing about tariffs is that we have seen news that from the current U.S. administration that there can be potential import tariffs imposed on semiconductors, the so-called Section 232 tariffs to be imposed on semiconductors. However, we don't hear about tariffs that may be imposed on EV batteries, and that the reason behind the difference in why they're talking about imposing tariffs, whereas not on EV batteries, is because the main use or the purpose of using import tariffs is to stop imports, at the same time trying to promote the domestic industry, which is competing with the imports, and maybe further to induce foreign investment into the domestic industry so that foreign money can be used to promote the domestic industry. And so when it comes to semiconductors, we have seen previously that foreign chip suppliers like Korea and Taiwan are very important players in the supply chain for semiconductors. And so the U.S. needs close cooperation with Korea and Taiwan, foreign semiconductor producers. So they want to bring in the semiconductor supply chain into the U.S. And so they're using tariffs to stop them from exporting, but they want to bring the foreign chip makers into the U.S. territory to build factories so that the semiconductor domestic industry can be promoted. And so I believe that because of that reason, they're trying to use tariffs. But the challenge is there because semiconductors are also major inputs for producing manufacturing goods in the U.S. So if you impose tariffs, like 15% or 20%, that means the input costs will go up. And ultimately, that will lead to higher prices for the manufactured goods that consumers buy. And so it could cause inflation for the U.S. market. And so it's not an easy issue for the government to decide upon. So a key question that comes from this issue here is, will the Section 232 tariffs on semiconductors really be imposed? That is an imminent question that trade policy experts like myself are interested in, and of course the semiconductor chip makers, which have invested billions of money in the US. My observation is that in the end, it may be difficult to impose too high level of tariffs on semiconductors, because that would mean that it would increase input costs, as I have mentioned, and that would drive up the inflation prices for the manufacturing goods in the US industry. And so I think in the end, the US government would have to consider what the ultimate benefit would be for the US economy. And so that is an issue that we need to look at. And another main tool that I talked about for strengthening economic security, especially for the semiconductor industry and the EV batteries, are subsidies. These are an industrial policy mechanism, or a tool for industrial policy for promoting the domestic industry. And subsidies can be used to promote a domestic industry, but also it can be withdrawn. And what we see here, interesting, is that for the semiconductor industry, we have heard about the CHIPS Act. But for the EV batteries, there is the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act is composed actually of two types of subsidies. One for supporting the purchasers of EVs in the form of credits, namely the $7,500 for each consumer who are buying EVs. That actually has been repealed. But there's another part of IRA, the so-called AMPC, the Advanced Manufacturing Production Credit, which is provided, which is a tax credit provided for producers that use advanced manufacturing input. That is not being repealed, that's been retained. As for the CHIPS Act, it's retained, but it's not really being implemented. What I mean is that the CHIPS Act, for example, has pledged, well, the US government has pledged to provide $4.6 billion to Samsung, for example, for building the Taylor factory. But to our knowledge, it's not been dispersed yet. And so my takeaway from this is that the subsidy policies are being used to lure foreign investors into the US market, but may continue to be a high-hanging fruit. So versus a low-hanging fruit, because it provides the incentive for foreign investors to come into the US to build the factories that will help the semiconductor industry be booming and to reshore the semiconductor competitiveness. However, because it has use as a lure for foreign investors, it may still be retained, but whether they will actually be dispersed or not, I think, is an issue that we need to see. And the third main tool that's been used to strengthen economic security are export controls, as DGB has already mentioned. These are used because they are very useful to control the choke points in the supply chain. And especially for technology areas, export controls can be useful to block technology transfer especially to any adversarial country where you don't want your technology to be transferred to, in order to mainly to slow down technology advancement in that country so that it doesn't catch up. However, we see that export controls are being imposed on semiconductor manufacturing equipment and AI chips, whereas we don't hear about export controls on EV batteries. And my understanding is that for semiconductor industry, export controls are useful to block the technology transfer of advanced semiconductor manufacturing skills, whereas for EV batteries, the technology is already prevalent. China already has the technology, and so we don't really need to use export controls to block technology transfer. So I think my observation of the difference in the two. However, the problem of using export controls is mainly that despite the purpose of export controls to block technology transfer, in practice, advanced semiconductor technology has been flowing into countries like China. We have heard about DeepSeek, the AI model that China developed. So that's a major example. And another problem is that China can retaliate. It has apparently used export controls on critical minerals in retaliation against U.S. export controls on AI chips and the semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And so it can work to the benefit, but also it attracts the host country to retaliate by using their own export controls. So there is lack of effectiveness in using export controls as well. However, there's another key question that we can think about when it comes to export controls. Will export controls be tightened under the current U.S. administration? That is an issue that we need to look at. And my observation is it remains to be seen, because so far we have seen very incoherent policy approach by the current administration. Because in July this year, the current administration announced the AI Action Plan. And if you look at that initiative, it actually aims to tighten export controls. And it aims to aim for closer coordination with its technology allies. So basically to ask the semiconductor manufacturing countries like Korea and Taiwan, the Netherlands and Japan to join in imposing export controls against China. However, we also see that recently the current administration, the government, the president, has allowed NVIDIA chips to be sold to China. And so it sends a very confusing message. So it remains to be seen whether export controls will be tightened under the current administration or not. So having mentioned about all these challenging aspects, in order to make the U.S.-Korea cooperation work for strengthening our economic security, especially related to strategic industry sectors, I think that we need to work on these aspects in the sense that perhaps we need to strengthen our cooperation at the state level, where the actual foreign investments are being made. For example, we have the LG Energy Solution plant that's going to be built in Arizona, Phoenix. We already have the Hyundai Motors plant in Atlanta, and in Texas we have the Samsung Semiconductors factories. And despite all these threats or potential challenges coming from imposition of tariffs, repeal of subsidies, or the use of export controls, state-level subsidies or state-level incentives could help these foreign companies to still invest and provide the beneficial impact of the foreign investments that are being made. So I would like to stop here, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thanks much. Yeah. So our first speaker will be Rodrigo Balbantin, who is the Associate Director of Trade, IT and Digital Technology Governance at Information Technology and Innovation Foundation.
So thank you. I will start with my experience on the Korea World Cup, because I really suffered that World Cup. I'm originally from Chile. Chile didn't qualify. Also in Chile, but in the southern hemisphere, it's in the middle of the winter, so it was like my high school exam period, and I had to, my religion forced me to watch every game of the World Cup, so I had to watch every game like at 2 a.m. during the exam period. And third, Brazil won that World Cup, so I really suffered during that World Cup. Anyway, less important than football, I'm going to talk about semiconductors. First of all, I'm Rodrigo Balbantin, Associate Director of Trade, IP, and Digital Technology Governance at ITIF, Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We're a leading world tech policy think tank. We work basically in all sectors of where there are R&D intensive in semiconductors, pharma, you name it, basically. And we're based in Washington, D.C. We also have an office in Seoul. We have a Center for Korean Competitiveness. First of all, I'm gonna be brief in this presentation just to open the floor for more discussion, but I'm gonna present about the global semiconductor industry, then the shared challenge. You can guess which country is that shared challenge, and then what is the path forward for the semiconductor industry, the cooperation in the semiconductor industry. So first of all, I guess everybody knows, but semiconductors are the more complex engineering task in humanity. So I will start by that requires we were talking about the 2 nanometer Samsung chip. One nanometer, I guess, if you don't know, is the length of a nail that grows during a day. So it's really, really small. So that's the level of complexity of semiconductors. This is in size, I mean, it's big, but not as big as actually the impact that it has. The impact that it has is 11 trillion of the world economy. The world economy is 110, 120 trillion, so it's around, the direct impact of this industry is nearly 10% of the world economy. It's a dual use technology that can be used in hypersonics and you know, AI and the rest of AI and so on. And basically is the foundation of basically the future economy and the race for the 21st century is defined by the rest of semiconductors. Just to put that in context and scope what is this technology about. It's a global technology, whether countries want it or not. The whole process requires, I don't know, you can see how insignificant is Chile there. It's not even in the map. But anyway, I'm American now, so I qualify to this World Cup. So it is a global, that requires a global supply chain, and this is just examples because basically we all use the semiconductor chips at different scales and so on. My colleague already presented this graph, but this is market share. So this is the revenues of global of chips company, but this is different than the manufacturing. The U.S. have 14% of global manufacturing. Thanks to the CHIPS Act, it's going to be 20% of the global manufacturing. Below China, below the 90% that Korea now have. But still, Korea represents in terms of, I mean, the Korean champions that we already mentioned, represent that they are the second top in terms of market share and global revenues of the industry. This is just to highlight, you know, like, first of all, I wrote a few months ago about the case of Japan and semiconductor industry and what happened during the 80s. Happy to talk more about that. But then, okay, shared challenge. First of all, and this is a research that we have on ITIF. We call it Hamilton Index. Basically, we measure the 10 strategic industries, semiconductors, pharma, basic metals, etc. And we measure basically the global output and the global market share of these key industries. So you can see the rise of China and the stagnation of the United States. By the way, without the ICT industry, the United States will be at around 5% lower, 5 percentage points lower than in this graph that has been sustained in the last decade and a half. The data, we're going to update the data. This is based on OECD data. They're going to release the new data set for 2023 on January this year, so the next year. So we're going to update this, but this is the most recent data available that we have now. And you can see that Korea has been fairly steady, yet declining in terms of strategic industries. If we go industry by industry, we use something that is called the location quotient, which is basically this is basically just to weight the size of the country and see how successful is each industry compared to the size of the country relative to the size of the world. I don't know you're following, but basically we can see that the United States leads in IT services and so on, but but it's not as big and significant as the relative size of the semiconductor and computer electronics industry in Korea because of the size of the world. But basically what also this graph says is that in what the US is good at is actually, and this is a first sign of complementarities, is basically where Korea has the lowest location coefficient is based on our research. Second, and this is shared challenge, is China, the big dragon in the room. We last year we released a series of studies based on each of the 10 Hamilton Index industries. So we have one in semiconductor, one in pharma, etc., and so on and so on. And the one in semiconductors is basically China is still lagging behind. The Made in China plan, which is the main strategic plan that they outlined 10 years ago in 2015, they set the goal to have self-sufficiency in semiconductor at 70% of their supply chain by 2025. Some estimations, and we support those estimations, said that by the end of this year, China will be self-sufficient in semiconductor only in 30% of their supply chain. So basically, they are still lagging behind. And why? But yet, and this is another point that we can discuss in the panel, is they aim for self-sufficiency. So this is not something that other countries can opt or not. China wants to be self-sufficient. They updated the goal. They want to be now 70% self-sufficient by 2030. But as well as in other industries, the aim and the goal of self-sufficiency is something exogenous, and I will take it as a given in semiconductor industry, but in all the strategic industries. We also can discuss this later, but China has a policy of attraction, compulsion, and expulsion for foreign direct investment. I think Korean investment now is transitioning from the compulsion, which is basically technology transfer and attraction, to the expulsion phase. So we can also have that conversation, but this is not new for semiconductor. That happened in car industry, that happened in EVs, that happened in every strategic industry. China attracts, capture, and force technology transfer. Also, there is we have several studies on IP theft too. And then they expose basically because of they can take advantage of the scale of their own market. And if they don't fully expose the companies from the country, such as happened in Nokia and Ericsson, because Nokia and Ericsson still have some telecommunication investments in China, but that is actually used as a bargain tool for the European Union to coerce economically. Anyway, so the Korean market still is highly dependent in semiconductors on China, but this is mostly legacy chips, I understand. Yet also, I understand that Korea is, please correct me, but it's 70% dependent on raw materials and critical minerals for China, and they have the goal to lower that to 30% by 2030. So they are doing heavy investments on that, $70 billion, I understand. So, and also that's compounded with the EVs side. And anyway, you can see the complementarities of what the US is good at in the semiconductor supply chain vis-a-vis what Korea is specialized. We can I'm going to try to be short on this, sorry. And path forward, I'll say the challenge is shared. We have also published some vision in what an allied semiconductor supply chain should be. Competition among allies is inevitable, but it's a different scale and different dialogue that should be vis-a-vis a competition which is China, the big mercantilists in the world economy, and the type of dialogue that you can have, a rules-based dialogue that you can have with allied countries is way different than the type of competition, rivalry, and basically you are competing against a whole state when a company competes against China. So that's a different set of rules, that's a different set of tools that you need to use, vis-a-vis what can be a competition of, I don't know, Apple and Samsung, for example. It's a way different set of dialogue that should be had. So I want to also share that vision. I'm gonna skip skip that because we were a bit pressed on time, but the collaboration I think is I share the concerns on what's happening in the US vis-a-vis the 232 tariff. We haven't mentioned yet the immigration challenge. Challenge I think is an understatement. And the basically how, and also something that we haven't touched now is that the United States also is not fulfilling its commitment with the free trade agreement that we have with Korea. So that's another concern that we have. We are in interesting times, as people said, but I think whatever hurdles or whatever happened with the United States might be a pause in the rules, might be a pause and a reset in the relation, but it's something that too shall pass. The United States in 5 years or 10 years will be totally different as it is now. China will be the same and even more powerful. So I want to conclude with that. Oh, and just I want to highlight the importance of Arizona in the global semiconductor supply chain. Thank you.
So we can have our distinguished speakers back to the podium. So I think we have around like maybe 7 to 8 minutes for Q&A. And I have to say that your comment about Arizona being the better value of the world is actually very accurate. I just checked it and there's actually one place in North France which basically tries to get this designation in Europe. So we have some competition here. But yeah, please, any questions to our speakers about the topics they covered? Please, and do you want to introduce yourself? And
Sure.
yeah.
So I'm a political science student, but would you say that the greatest victories for strengthening semiconductor supply chains will be in like political spheres or more like material spheres, like production, refinement, or is it going to be in like subsidies or imports?
Is the general question or we are addressing
Anyone. It's sort of open-ended.
Okay.
Could you maybe elaborate a little further on
Yes, so I think one of the other speakers said that there's 3 different strategies for supply chains, which would be tariffs, subsidies, and export controls. But my question is, do you think that would be more effective rather than like the R&D in mining or production, refinement?
So yeah, I think there's a conjunction of both industries here where mining plays a big role for EV batteries, naturally for R&D as well, but the R&D and export controls and all of that pertain more to the semiconductor sector. So if your question is about which is the more effective way controlling the upstream to curb a country's ability to advance along the value chain, I think that's partly what is being attempted with regard to semiconductors. So as Professor Lee mentioned, the U.S. produces AMAT, Applied Materials Lab Research, the various and the ASMO of the Netherlands. These are all necessary for China to really produce advanced chips. And so curbing the export of those has been their method of choice to curb China's growth on that particular area. Now, in terms of the mining area, China is the key supplier of all the critical mines and the materials, the germaniums, the galliums, and the graphites that go into EV batteries. So, in fact, the entire world is very much vulnerable to Chinese choke points when it comes to EV batteries. But those two things, yes, you're right. I think handling and dealing with the upstream aspects is really the key to addressing the rise of pure competitors. I think that's what's been happening.
yeah, please.
Thank you first for the front answer. If I may add on to your reply to your question, I think that basically, in order to be successful in any technology industry, it has to be technology advancement. I mean, you have to be the leader in technology and R&D and then all the technology. You have to be first the leader. But the reason why we're seeing trade policy measures like tariffs and subsidies and export controls is because these technology itself, because basically the U.S.-China competition has reached a point where it has become, I think, very geopolitical, and the basic notion that former trade rules have not to maintain the U.S. leadership in the strategic technology areas is basically why the U.S. is using trade policies to prop up these efforts to maintain its leadership. And so the basic notion that China has been using unfair practices to become more competitive, that huge amounts of subsidy, so technology transfer using unfair IP leakage, so these notions that trade issues are involved has, I think, led to the use of trade policy measures. So basically tariffs are being used previously. We haven't heard about tariffs being used to, well, basically tariffs have been outlawed under US, WTO trade laws. But now we're seeing the weakening of WTO trade rules. And so I think that the weakening of the multilateral trade rules is another reason why we're seeing these trade policy measures being used for economic security purposes. And so it's, to answer your question, I don't think that it's a yes and no answer. Basically, in order to be successful in a strategic industry, you have to have the technology. But the reason why we're seeing these tariff trade policy measures is because that is not sufficient to become prevalent or to maintain the technology leadership. That's my answer.
I want to compliment, I want to, is it okay?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I want to compliment, and this is a mistake that most of us do, and I'm the first one to acknowledge that we talk about winning on semiconductor and so on. So there is no winning really because it's a never-ending competition. But if you are leading, by the characteristic of these industries, if you are leading, you are more likely to keep and expand that leadership. And that's seen in the foundries, and the leadership of TSMC, for example, on a specific choke points in the supply chain. So when you are leading in this industry, you are more likely to reinvest in R&D. You are more likely to get global scale because it's a business very scale dependent and so on. So there's no winning, but if the race is for something, is for market share, global market share and scale, because that's what keeps you to keep going in the industry.
So Meredith Wood,
Oh.
Professor Meredith Wood.
Sure. I don't need a microphone.
You don't?
Well, you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can always hear you.
Right. And so I just have some comments for the general public as well as for the speakers. And thank you very much for coming to ASU. It's always fun to have you guys each year. It's always fun to have the caravan come through. I'm reminded of the fact that Korea would never have been what it is today except for the United States. The United States provided the market for Korean products and provided also technology, which was transferred. And so this relationship has been a very symbiotic relationship. I'm very much mindful of the fact that as you have LG Energy Solution, now located only 20 minutes from here, that LG also would not have been what it is today, except for Apple producing all its desktops in Korea by LG until Foxconn ate LG's lunch by saying that they can do it better, faster, cheaper. And then Apple, as you know, went to China and trained 50 million people that now can understand the processes of how an iPhone is put together. And so you had a relationship which was built on availability of the market in the US and technology transfer from the United States. Now we have a very interesting, evolving situation where the US government says you gotta pay to play. And these countries have never faced the situation of what it means to pay to play. But, what actually will happen is a very big question. We hear plenty of horror stories about the companies coming in to a place like Arizona where but obstacles in the way of producing gigafactories, let alone an ecosystem built around gigafactories. Oftentimes in Asia, you have this publicity about Arizona or the desert. You got rattlesnakes, you got cacti, you got brown earth, right? But in reality, what happens here that never get really reported is that there's a reason why they're here. So let me give you some examples. When you think about engineers in this area, engineers are produced in this university like popcorn get produced by popcorn machine, just bubbles up. We have 34,000 engineers on this campus. TSMC would never have thought to relocate here, except for the fact that ASU has 34,000 engineers. Nobody in the world, maybe except in China, has 34,000 engineers on campus. Each year we produce 7,000 engineers. And this gives comfort to the likes of LG Energy Solution and TSMC to move in here. So that's important to remember. Clean energy is terribly important to Arizona, and Arizona is the world leading place for understanding the technology as well as science of clean energy because we have to. We are pioneers in understanding how to preserve water, how to recycle water, how to produce water in a state that doesn't have waterfalls. I mean, rainfalls as much as in other places. Therefore, if you look at a university like this, we are the leader of what you call NSF engine. We are the leader globally of understanding sustainability and the science of it. And we lead other countries, other states here in the Southwest in that sustainability engine. And I think these things are very, very important, which is not to say that there aren't challenges. There are going to be challenges, and Koreans and the Americas need to sort of figure out how you deal with the challenges. So for instance, one challenge might be that although we produce more engineers than you know what to do with, we do not produce as many technicians who are needed today. STEM-based technicians, they can deal with very sophisticated works that still are needed even if you got robotics doing the work. And so these things are going to be important. Maybe this is an area where Koreans and Americans can collaborate together. Koreans themselves had hell of a time trying to persuade people to become technicians or go to schools for producing technicians. And we now face in this country the same issue of how to create the workforce that can deal with the changing and emerging technologies. So these are very interesting emerging challenges that we need to work together, but I have no doubt that LG ENSOL, what do you call it, Energy Solution, actually found a very good location, deciding to situate only 20 minutes from us.
Professor Itagra,
Yeah.
who's also from ASU.
I'm a professor here at the School for the Future of Innovation. So my question is for Director General Lee. I was really appreciative of your reminder of the history of the relationship between the U.S. and Korea going back to the World War I, World War II, and then the Korean War. Yeah, no, I'm leading up to you because it sort of reinforced for me what the shock must have been at the current moment. Because in a sense, given that intensely intimate relationship for all these years, to suddenly have it all turned around in a matter of just a few months really, must have been quite a shock. So I guess I'm going to ask you, if you, to the extent that it's possible for you to respond, what is Korea's plan B? If it cannot rely on the United States in the way that it has been used to for all these decades, I'm thinking of two areas in particular. One is the question of nuclear energy and nuclear power and weapons, because I know there's been some conversation about the possibility of developing a nuclear response in South Korea. And the second is a diversification of multilateral relations, or thinking about other countries as potential partners. Not so much to replace the United States, but if this is going to continue into the future. And I think there's no guarantee that after this administration things will change that radically. What are you guys thinking about?
Well, thank you. I mean, those are absolutely critical questions that are, in fact, the very issues that we do grapple with, as a matter of fact. And I think your question and her comments actually relate to one another in the sense that if any of us gave the impression, if either Dr. Lee or I sort of gave the impression that we were ungrateful for all the historical support that we did in fact receive, and which were in fact critical to our industrial takeoff, that was not the intention. I think one has to appreciate that for any international order to be durable, it has to be consistent with the long-term interests of the most powerful country. And that is at the moment the United States, and has long been the United States. So as an ally of the United States, we have to give the US a little more slack in their ability to adjust the world order in a way that they perceive to be compatible with their long-term interests. And we do believe that the current phase that we're going through, the uncertainties, the tumult, the changes, the unfamiliar terrain, all of this is part and parcel of that process. What we hope for, however, is that at the end of the tunnel, we will again be able to have a predictable and sustainable footing on which to advance this relationship. You mentioned and asked about Plan B amidst this uncertainty. Our Plan B is very much aligned with what Secretary Hegseth and Undersecretary Colby have been saying, is that, and that is that the United States does not need dependencies as allies. What they need is capable partners. And that's precisely what we're trying to do. We're trying to become more capable, more able, and hence more self-reliant and less dependent on our allies. So graduating from that dependency, whether technologically, industrially, or militarily, is what we're seeking to do. And so this administration under President Lee Jae-myung is fully committed to making sure that we can hold our own against either the China competition, other geopolitical challenges within the region, by relying less, depending less on the United States. And again, that's consistent with the interests of the United States going forward as well. So I'll say that. On nuclear propulsion submarines, I just want to make sure that everyone understands that these are conventionally armed nuclear propulsion submarines, and that the Korean government is fully committed to our non-proliferation obligations. Brazil does not receive, your neighbor doesn't receive criticism for having pursued nuclear propulsion submarines, perfectly consistent with IAEA obligations and non-proliferation related obligations. So that's where we are. Now, one has to note that it takes time to actually deploy these nuclear propulsion submarines. So it'll take a good 15 years or 10 to 15 years for them to actually be in the waters. And they'll be in operations for the next 30 to 40 to 50 years. So these assets are in fact aimed at dealing with the geopolitical picture, the maritime domain, not of today, but of 30 years later. And at a time when the North Koreans are also developing their own nuclear propulsion submarines, also in contrast to what Korea is doing, they're actually seeking SLBMs that are nuclear tipped. In that case, one has to have more assets tracking these. They'll be reaching out to the Pacific Ocean as well, so we'll need capabilities to track those. Nuclear energy, Korea is seeking enrichment capabilities because we are 30% dependent on Russian nuclear fuel to run our 26 nuclear reactors. We're the 5th largest producer of nuclear energy in the world, and we're entirely dependent on imports for our nuclear fuel. The world is seeking to phase out Russian fuel. We'll have to come up with alternative sources at a time when data centers are increasingly calling for energy. So it only makes natural sense for the 5th largest producer of nuclear oil with good, solid, non-proliferation credentials to seek this capability. And we're really grateful and appreciate the fact that the US administration has supported our efforts to do so. Lastly, diversification. We are seeking to diversify our engagements overseas, but this is not necessarily to replace our alliance with the United States. It's to make sure that we also have like-minded partners. We partner more strongly with like-minded partners that are also committed to upholding the rules-based order. So that's where it is.
Maybe a final question? Yeah, please. And I will actually, if you can introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm a visiting scholar from China, sorry. Everyone, I know this topic is about US and South Korea, but everyone can bypass the elephant in the room is China. So my question is a good way to hire less Chinese engineer in your company? Is a good way to compete with China? I have 2 friends, one graduated from Stanford and do postdoc research here. One got a PhD here in EE. they try their best to find a job in semiconductor industry, but they can't. Right now, both of them went back to China. One in Cartel to do the EV battery, one in Huawei to design the chips. So my question is a good way to hire less Chinese engineer or Chinese students to compete with China?
Say that, or you want to say that?
It's not easy question. Sorry.
I don't know why they want to.
So, back in the early 2000s, China made a strategic decision of learn by legal and non-legal means about global technology, not only in the US, but also Europe, Japan, and Korea. So part of that is their programs, the 1,000 Talents, I don't know if you're part of or so on, but you know, the programs of getting people out and learn about, but also there are other non-legal ways that China has still technology and still IP. So if it's a good idea or not, I think to hire Chinese graduates or not, I think the US now doesn't have a strategy on how to deal about this legacy of more than 20 years of policies by the Chinese Communist Party of IP. There's a new book, it's called The Great Heist, a very good one. Suggest you to read that, about the history of China's strategy on IP theft and so on. So the US doesn't have a strategy to deal with that. As far as I understand, no other country also have a real strategy on how to cope with that. So if you ask me if it's a good idea or not, I would say that would be a specific patch solution, not attacking the big problem. So my main, trying to push the policy forward is thinking about the overall strategy. If that includes hiring more or not, I really don't have an answer. The president now is starting with his own administration because he wants 600,000 Chinese students, and his coalition don't like any type of migrant, so that's their problem. But you know, I think that the biggest problem is that the lack of long-term strategy to deal with all of this.
You know, I would really disagree with you on this.
Okay.
About whether there ought to be a strategy in. All countries that want to industrialize rapid and catch up to somebody who is better off than you are will steal technology, will copy technology, will have an industrial policy, will come up with whatever means to mobilize the populace so that you can industrialize faster than the guy who is ahead of you. This is what England did, this is what Germany did, this is what the United States did. It's not something that China only does. This is what Korea did, this is what Japan did. And so all countries that want to economically develop will combine all sorts of methods. Some of it might be using, if you want to call it blueprint, or you want to call it stealing, you steal. And you do whatever you can while you try to figure out how to build the capacity within your country in terms of manpower, in the brains of the people, in the hands of the people that understand the process. And as I mentioned before, through American investment in China, through trade, the Chinese are developing the capacity. Now, it'll be very difficult for the United States to figure out how to win ourselves in this war, because we do know that number one, import substitution industrialization doesn't really work. You should know you're from Chile, right? And even if it works, we wouldn't know how to implement it. So we got a real problem. And the evidence is coming in that the more you try to stop the Chinese, it's like trying to catch the shirt of, Lionel or something like that. If you try to block it through import control, as was happening under Biden regime, and then you try all kinds of different things under the current regime, it's just going to be really difficult. You know, every day, the NVIDIA guy, Huang, comes up with a million ideas as to why it's not a good idea to try to block the Chinese this way, because then Hui will just work harder and harder to produce the next generation. Well, that might not be a good explanation, but the fact of the matter is that one way or the other, when you got the processes in your hands and the knowledge in the brains and a huge market that is self-sufficient, capable of self-sufficiency like the Chinese market, and an industrial policy that kind of makes sense in light of what China is, what it can be, I think it's going to be very difficult, and I think we need some soul searching as to what is a really good strategy for this country to stay ahead, not necessarily in competitive sense, but doing right by the people, making sure that we make investment in our people, in our institutions, and in our infrastructure.
I don't see a disagreement. Coming from Washington, I always say that if we put 10% of the effort of thinking how to push American industry forward, as compared of the time that we are thinking of how to stop China, this country will be in another position. So I don't see that disagreement. I think we are only, in general, just thinking how to stop the rival without a more propositive, and what's happening now with universities, R&D investment, pushing away not only Chinese migrants from everywhere, is not helping. So I don't see that disagreement.
I'll just add, I actually very much agree with everything you said in your first comment, but as it relates to this, I agree with the second part of your comment, but very much respectfully disagree with the first part of your comment, which is that yes, Britain, Korea, the U.S., we all did that. We've done that before, but for a country of 14 billion, which aims to achieve dual circular economy, meaning it is self-sufficient domestically and wants the rest of the world to depend on the Chinese market to fuel its own growth, is sort of frightening, precisely because of its size. If you have a small country like Barbados seeking to achieve dual circular economies and become self-reliant across the board, it doesn't create much fear or repercussions to its neighboring countries. But if you have a country of that size, by PPP terms, far and away the largest economy in the world, achieving that kind of self-reliance and that kind of overseas dependence on its economy, that generates vulnerabilities for other countries. Added to that is, of course, the unique system, the political system of that particular country, in which STEM students are sometimes, often, as we know, by statute, required to transfer certain knowledge that they are asked to do so. So this generates concerns, and I think to completely dismiss this sort of concern that has legitimate reasons is dangerous, especially for countries that feel the heat of that competition and the challenge of their security apparatus. So I just think it's risky sort of completely sweeping under the rug the dangers. And I may have misunderstood your comment, but again, I can relate to the latter part of your recommendations and your observations. But the first part is I think we have to be a little more careful about how we treat the issue of potential espionage, industrial espionage through students, or so I would say there's some kernel of truth in those concerns, if you will allow.
I would like to thank all of you, and I think we asked the right question, and I think we are going to ask this question for next maybe 5-10 minutes or so. Please basically give a round of applause to our speakers for every insight.